I think if you were to look at Silicon Valley as a case study, and why it's so innovative is they haven't had to go to the government and say, can I have permission to go and develop a software tool that fixes internet infrastructure? They just go do it. So I would say really at its core, the high-tech sector has been a permissionless type of place. You don't see that in a lot of other sectors. You have to go to the government really to do anything to get it approved. And there may be some very specific examples where, because it's life-threatening, or there's a really significant reason. I mean, Tom Palmer's really good at saying we should start with permissionless and then work backwards and then justify why it shouldn't be permissionless. I think the problem with most other sectors, we start from you need permission and then we work backwards to permissionless.
This is Atlas Network with Michael Carnuccio.
Welcome back to the Atlas Network podcast, where we bring you face-to-face with the people shaping the worldwide freedom movement. I'm your host, Michael Carnuccio. Today, I'm joined by someone who truly embodies the spirit of enterprising liberty. That's Atlas Network's Chief Innovation Officer. He's not only behind the Radical Innovation Summit that just concluded in Mexico City not too long ago, but also one of the visionaries steering Atlas Network's Innovation Lab, a frontier for policy disruption through entrepreneurial ideas. In this episode, we're diving into the future of freedom, from decentralized finance to the diffusion of innovation in restrictive regimes. And if you're curious about how cryptocurrencies, local social entrepreneurs, and Atlas Network's global partnerships are changing the rules of the game, well, you're in the right place. Lyall, thank you so much for being with us today. We're excited to have you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me too.
Well, let's dive right in with a conversation about the Radical Innovation Summit, right? It just completed in Mexico City not too long ago. You were one of the visionaries behind this and helped put it together. Why? What is the Radical Innovation Summit, and what's the genesis of it?
Yeah, I think we were looking at the environment and saying, okay, where does the freedom movement need to be more aware? And we started doing a cohort, at least to begin with, just on the crypto side of things. And so there had been a few meetings around that. And as we got okay, there's not just crypto's one piece of it, but there's kind of this broader decentralized space. And so we thought, listen, we need to be playing here, and not just because we want to me too, but there's authentically a place for us to play here. And how do we, is there a place where we can gather those in our movement that are authentically working on this space, where we also bring in experts? So this was never just partners, right? So we were trying to bring in technologists, people who were otherwise involved and invested in the freedom movement, to dig into some substantive issues that are relevant for where we are, right? So what are some of the privacy issues that are being brought up, or where is crypto going, and what does it look like? And is the crypto a bubble? Is it fake? How do we think about currency and currency manipulation, and where are those things? So we really wanted to create a place where those who were doing work could come. We also thought it would be an interesting place to start to workshop some of those projects. And so we, from the get-go, we spent a day in kind of what we call a co-creation process, where we bring 10 projects to the university, and they get people giving them input, feedback, tweaking, and they get to really workshop what they're trying to do and accomplish. We felt like would be really useful, kind of an iron sharpening iron kind of a thing. And then have more formal programming where we really address some of these bigger issues and concerns and opportunities that the movement needs to be aware of and playing in. So that was in our mind. And then, there was the emergence of this university in Mexico, this classically liberal university, and they really wanted to be on the forefront of innovation as well. And so it was kind of place where we could marry what we wanted to do in a location in the university where they could be our host, and that it fit with what they were trying to create. And so that's where, the idea, we pitched it to them, say, listen, we think there's an opportunity. Here's what we'd like it to look like. And they bought in and said, yeah, we think this would be really cool. We'd love to do it here. And so for the last 3 years, we have, been iterating, and, each year is a little bit different than the past because we keep learning. But I think we've had some substantive, meaningful conversations. We've, worked on some really critical projects, several of which have already begun to take shape and have had an impact, including one of our Ukrainian partners that won last year. They are now a critical voice in the crypto policy conversation in Ukraine. So they have a seat at the table, and that was really started, and, they got their initial funding there in Mexico City as part of the Shark Tank piece of that summit that we ended up doing. So I think it's really given us an opportunity to have people raise their hands that they're playing in this space, connect them with other smart people who are involved more on the technology side of things, that I think ultimately makes our movement better. And of course gives us better insight into where things are going when it comes to decentralized technologies, and our role and our partners' role in shaping that conversation and future moving forward.
So, talking about disruptive technology, and I'm sure everyone that just heard that phrase is thinking either AI or crypto or maybe something else. And of course, Atlas Network's been on the forefront of those conversations with the worldwide freedom movement. But from your perspective, if someone's not paying attention or thinking about this right now, why does the worldwide freedom movement need to be interested in disruptive technologies?
I think we learned some maybe hard lessons in what I would say was the last major wave of technology disruption around social media. And I think we got to the party a little bit late. And as a result, we maybe weren't in front of some of the key conversations around how those technologies were developed. And we saw some of the deplatforming and some of the other issues emerge. And it wasn't really until Musk bought Twitter and you kind of broke up the monopoly, so to speak, that some real changes happened there. So I think, from my perspective, it's something we can't ignore. It's I think we've gotten past there was a lot of hype, and similar to the internet bubble that happened in the early 2000s, there was a lot of hype there. And then out of that crash where the NASDAQ lost half its value emerged, some really substantive changes and disruption. So I think part of my thinking and looking at this was like, this isn't going to go away. These technologies, yeah, they've gone through some of the early ugly phase and, predictions, but they're here to stay. And I think we're also seeing on the flip side of this, particularly on the AI side, maybe not so much on the crypto side, but on the AI side, authoritarian regimes are really stepping in and they're using them in ways that are not healthy. So I just felt like we've got to be more intentional about how we engage and get on front of the wave, as opposed to trying to catch up to a wave that in some ways, I won't say passed us by, but we were late to the party a bit when it comes to the social media revolution that took place, 2 decades ago.
Do you sense a Overton window type opportunity right now with this conversation for the worldwide freedom movement, or do you still feel like we're trying to catch up and there's more questions than maybe entrepreneurial ideas in the space?
I think there's a couple really important opportunities for us. One, I think on the privacy front, I think AI has, and what China's doing in some of these other places where you're constantly being monitored. And so I think there's a real opportunity. I think the phrase that privacy is great for private citizens, transparency is great for governments. And so, how do we go in that direction? So I think there's an important opportunity for us to reinforce the primacy of privacy for the individual. I think another area that's really fascinating from my perspective and a window of opportunity for us is to really reestablish the concept of property rights in a much broader way than how it's been defined or talked about, I would say, in our movement, which it's mostly been around like my assets, my business, the land that my house is on, and get back to, I think more of the original definition was it's property of self. And so you have this concept of name, image, and likeness. I mean, for those of us who follow sports in America, that's the whole NIL, sports thing that's happening. But I think there's something really to that in the AI age, right? If a deep fake is made of me, my personal intellectual property, Denmark recently passed a law basically giving a person copyright protection over themselves. I don't know. I mean, I haven't done a deep dive on the law, so I can't say whether was well constructed or not. But I think that speaks to an opportunity for us to go back to much more the original meaning of property rights and open up a conversation, and I think really move the Overton window in a really significant way when it comes to property rights, which has multiple downstream effects for other things that we're trying to advocate for. So I think there's actually a pretty cool opportunity, both in terms of putting a check on government on privacy, but then also property rights. And what does that really mean in ways that could help reshape policymaking for decades to come if we take advantage of it.
We're talking with Dr. Lyall Swim, Chief Innovation Officer for Atlas Network. You can see more of Lyall's work and that of his colleagues by going to atlasnetwork.org. Let's talk about the Innovation Lab. How does that work differ a little bit from traditional policy reforms?
So I think a couple of key things that I'm thinking about from an Innovation Lab standpoint. Number one is how do we help the broader freedom movement be future ready, right? What we sit in kind of a unique position where we've got 525, 550 inputs coming in from all these partners around the world. So what may seem like a one-off in one country, if we're hearing it from 10 different people in 10 different countries, allows us potentially to see some trends where we need to maybe get out in front of something. And again, we just got that data that a single organization or entity may not have. So I think there's a unique place for us to be thinking about that, be looking out. And I know Brad's done some writing in that. And I think the Innovation Lab at its core is working to embrace this more of how do we think about helping the movement be ready for the next 5-10 years, and what should we be paying attention to? Not that we'll be the expert in that, because we've got a lot of great entrepreneurs out there, but maybe we could be the ones say, hey, listen, we're seeing something. How do we respond? And using kind of our normal, the coach, compete, celebrate model to address that and create solutions to that. So I think that's one. I think the second one is once we do see something, then how do we maybe identify the questions that we should be thinking about, and how do we start to have meaningful conversation and progress toward those? So for us right now, the three big questions that apply to the decentralized space as we think about the movement and being future ready is, how do we become fast second adopters, right? We're not in Silicon Valley. That's not where we play. But now that we've demonstrated the value of AI and crypto and others, how do we be a fast second adopter or an early adopter? You may get into kind of some of the nomenclature of diffusion a little later. But how do we be early adopters, not late adopters in this? So how do we adopt the technology, but do it in a strategic way? Because the landscape's changing quickly. So how do we do it in a thoughtful, strategic way? Number two, are there tools that we ought to be thinking about and building, and problems that maybe we're in a unique position to solve? So, and there's examples of that. The Open Hearings Project by Grassroot Institute, I should say, is one of those with their Open Hearings Project. So are there tools to build that can accelerate the work that we do using crypto, AI, et cetera? And then the final question is, what are the policy conversations we need to either be driving, responding to? What are some of the public narratives we ought to be shaping in this space? So for us, that's really, I would say right now, that's the big thing that we're focused on, is how do we address those three questions within our movement?
And should mention, folks, if you go with Atlas Network with Michael Carnuccio and look for my conversation with Joe Kent of the Grassroot Institute. You'll hear that discussion about open hearings and the work that they're doing that really is cutting edge, and pretty excited about what's happening there in Hawaii. Lyall, anyone who has seen you talk, whether it be a plenary or on a panel or just had a conversation with you, has heard this phrase, permissionless innovation, right? I like to think you coined the term. You probably didn't, but you like to talk about it quite a bit. And so for our audience, what does that mean, or what does it mean as you're using it and talking about it, and how that applies to the worldwide freedom movement?
So, I mean, at a very basic level, permissionless anything, right, really refers to, do we have to ask the government for permission to do something?
Right.
So, or where there's some sort of middleman that's in between, that's kind of either by law or whatever else inserting themselves in between two parties that want to interact and engage with each other. So as we think about permissionless transactions, I mean, crypto, I don't need a formal banking system, right? I don't need a middleman quite the same way, which, there's the value in the banking system, but there's also things that the government's done where they've made it easy to deplatform. Now, the flip side of that is there's also bad actors who are transacting, and so you're trying to navigate that too. But at a very fundamental level is, how do we? And the tech sector has been really interesting. I think it's one of the reasons why there's so much innovation. So little of what they do when they develop, they have to ask the government for permission to do. So I think if you were to look at Silicon Valley as a case study, and why it's so innovative, is they haven't had to go to the government and say, can I have permission to go and develop a software tool that fixes internet infrastructure? They just go do it. So I would say really at its core, the high-tech sector has been a permissionless type of place. You don't see that in a lot of other sectors. You have to go to the government really to do anything to get it approved. And there may be some very specific examples where, because it's life-threatening, or there's a really significant reason. I mean, Tom Palmer's really good at saying we should start with permissionless and then work backwards and then justify why it shouldn't be permissionless. I think the problem with most other sectors, we start from you need permission and then we work backwards to permissionless. So with the tech sector, in their particular case, it has been permissionless, and then later on there's asking for permission. So even if you look at like Uber, right? They went in and created a platform. They didn't ask for permission from the taxi cab units or the taxi cab unions. They just went in and created a platform, said, we'll ask for forgiveness, but we're building something cool. And, you shouldn't have to ask for permission to drive a car to take somebody from point A to point B. So that's a non-crypto permissionless tool. But a lot of these platforms, and these side hustles, it's really creating opportunities for people they don't have to ask the government to go do something. They just need a platform or way in which they can better transact between each other and create value.
When we talk about value and opportunity, how do you balance the opportunity with innovation and a lot of these new platforms or anything that you're seeing with the risks, right? Whether it be fraud, or you mentioned even earlier before, authoritarian regimes, right? Leveraging that against people. So someone that's in your catbird seat more than the rest of us typically, how do you balance those risks, or how do you think through those?
Yeah, we finished with the softball questions, haven't we, Michael? You went straight for the slider. Yeah, I mean, I think, part of the balance, I think Tom's litmus test does serve well here, right? Like if we can start with the presumption of permissionlessness and then we work our way backward. I think the founders, from a U.S. standpoint, were pretty clear, right? In the Federalist Papers, where Adams says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. I think they fully recognize that, we don't live in a utopia. We live in a place where people will do harm to each other. And so, you do have bad actors, you do have evil evil in the world. And so how do you counteract against those who would use one instrument that could be used for extreme good? Can it, by the same token, be used for significant harm and damage? So I think if we start with permissionless as an assumption and work our way backwards, that's a good place to start. I think anytime you're dealing with legitimate loss of life or harm to life, there's important questions to be asked there. So if I think about areas, for example, in medicine, if somebody's going to do something that could potentially, AI, one of the areas that they're looking at is, how do they diagnose and use AI tools to better diagnose? I'd want to be careful with that. Not that we shouldn't create innovation, and there's absolute reason that could make healthcare less expensive. But we may want a bit more oversight there to ensure that people aren't being put unduly in harm's way. And so I think the human risk factor, but again, I think sometimes there's too broad a brush where that gets painted. So we still have to be careful. But to me, those are maybe two balances that I might put on one side. If it could result in the unnecessary loss of life as one, potential touchstone on one side, and then the other side, can we start from I shouldn't start by asking permission. I should be able to just go ahead and innovate. And, again, I'm not the policy analyst. I'm not the attorney. So I wish I had a better answer, but it's not one that that's why we have the Radical Innovation Summit. So the smart people who are attorneys and are dealing with this every day, is a good question for them. And it's one I think, as a broader movement, I don't have an answer, but I think as a movement, we need a better answer to that question.
Folks, I want to encourage you, if you're enjoying this conversation and many others that you see on this podcast, please go to atlasnetwork.org now. Click on that donate button and join hundreds and thousands of your peers throughout the globe that are supporting the worldwide freedom movement, including my wife and I that are members of the Atlas Club. And we encourage you to join the Atlas Club with us, or the $25 one-time contribution. You'll get a copy of Freedom's Champion magazine, and you'll get to learn all about the stories of some of the folks on the front line fighting for freedom all across the world. We're talking with Dr. Lyall Swim, Chief Innovation Officer for the Atlas Network. And Lyall, as we're sitting here having this discussion, I've got this thought in my head, like, why is Lyall so interested? Like, why is he a Chief Innovation Officer? Where did this happen, right? Like, so let's take a step back and just first describe for me, when you meet someone in the worldwide freedom movement for the first time, tell them what you do, and they say, what does that mean? How do you describe the role that you have with Atlas Network?
Oh, well, like anything, it evolved. I think early on, there were some strategies where we were trying to experiment. I think we've always had a bit of that in our DNA. And so, sometimes it's been a donor that has had an interesting idea that we've said, maybe there's something there to it. Or maybe as we look and observe from where we are, we see an opportunity across the movement that, maybe isn't being addressed. And so can we maybe help get the ball rolling? I think, over the last, year and a half, we really narrowed down and I think kind of found our footing in terms of what does it really mean? And it's a little bit of what I said before. At its core, how do we, from our unique position, or my unique position in Atlas Network, but then Atlas Network broadly, how do we future ready the movement so that we're taking advantage of opportunities to move the Overton window in unique ways. We're paying attention to trends that could create problems for freedom in the future, and whether that's the populism trend. I mean, we're kind of catching up to that. What could we have been a bit better? Could we have been a bit more forward-looking? Say, the movement in Chile with the constitutional crisis that they had, right? So, how are we being a little bit better at thinking out? I mean, it always surprised me. So I started my career in Silicon Valley, And I remember I worked for a semiconductor company, and I remember I was the investor relations analyst. So I was preparing the quarterly reports and writing the scripts for the CEO. And I would hear him talk. So this was back in 2000. I would hear him talk about, I guess it was 2001, hear him talk about cell phones and what they were going to do and what they were going to be. And I'm like, you're nuts. And everything he said, it's where we are, right? But at that point in time, there was no iPhone. There were, none of these things that we just take for granted, but he could see it, right? He could see out that far. A part of that was experience, his technical expertise, kind of the seat that he sat in. And so, I think for us a little bit, that's, can we be a little bit more that way, so that we're not surprised? I mean, obviously you can't always predict, you can't predict a COVID event. You can't predict some of these other things, but I think there are trends that if somebody's spending enough time looking at that, there are things that you can start to see before they get there, right? And so how can we then, with that knowledge, use our events, our trainings, et cetera, the cohorts that we convene to have those conversations and be ready for when the time comes.
This has been a topic that you've always been focused on and interested in, right? I mean, your graduate work, it was focused on kind of innovation and whatnot there. So take us back there to the beginning and a couple of these things that sparked you and got you interested. And part of the reason I'm asking this is there's probably others within the movement that are starting to think this way or be interested and pay attention as well. And they're trying to think about how to lean in. So share a little of your story, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. So my interest has been less about how to be innovative as a culture and more about how do you get innovation adopted, right? So, and in our case, how do you get policy adopted, which, innovation at a kind of a very basic level is just, a new way or an alternate way of doing something that we're currently doing right now. So some level of improvement on where things are. So I think where it really hit for me was I was working for a state-based group, the Sutherland Institute in Utah, and was there during kind of a major voucher push and initiative. So this was back in 2006, 2007. And there had been a fair amount of work before I got there. I was at Procter & Gamble, left there in 2006, came on board. And so I kind of joined midstream of what had been probably about a 2 to 3 year effort prior to that to work on some voucher related stuff, ultimately leading up to this universal voucher being passed in, I think it was February of 2007. So it got passed in 2007 and end of February. The governor signed it. And a month later, the teachers union had gathered enough signatures to use what was called the referendum process in Utah, which was really it's a process that allows the people to take any particular law and say, we don't like that. We're going to put it to the vote of the people. And if we don't like it, we'll actually say, no, thank you to that particular law. So they can kind of undo, if they think something's bad that the legislature did, they can actually undo it. So but you have to, again, certain amount of signatures, teachers union organized, put it on the ballot. That November, it got overturned. I think it was around 68% of the voters in Utah said no thank you to universal vouchers. Now, you look at the reverse of that. The Republican governor had won his election by, I think it was like 70%. And Utah at that time was probably a 60-40 split in terms of Republican versus Democrat. So the national folks, the national, I would say, school choice people said, well, Utah clearly is the place where we can do this. It's a Republican majority. We've got a Republican governor. He even ran that he would support it. So let's go ahead and do it here. And then we lost badly. Like we basically, so you clearly had a large chunk of Republicans who said, no, thank you to a free market solution to education. In the aftermath of that, people pointing fingers, doing assessment, why did we fail? And kind of the consistent answer was, well, teachers unions are so powerful in Utah. Everywhere else, it was the teachers union. And I just wasn't very happy with that answer. I felt like that's a cop-out. It's too easy. But I didn't really have any answers or ways to evaluate what we were doing. but it stuck with me. It was a painful lesson that I went through. So fast forward, I'm working on my doctorate, and kind of going through what are some of the questions that I feel like I'd like to answer or find answers to, that then I could build a research question around. And I went back to this experience, and I'd had a conversation with a professor at BYU. And I talked with her, said, here's some of the things that I'm interested in, and here's, that I think I'd like to maybe spend some time or maybe do a dissertation around. And when I talked to her about this kind of idea, why did a good idea get rejected? And she said, well, have you ever heard of the diffusion of innovations? I'm like, no, but it sounds interesting. And so she's like, you want to take a look at that? I think you're going to find some answers to what you're looking for. And so I, immediately went back online, got the book, and I said, this is it. This is what I want to study. So I, began formulating a research question. What was I trying to look at? And so for me, it really came down to, what are the accelerators or the inhibitors for a good idea going from nobody doing it to full mass adoption, that it's just the de facto standard of how things are done, right? So why did, for example, VHS get adopted versus beta, right? Why did Microsoft Word, Excel, and PowerPoint get adopted over what was WordPerfect, that actually had a better solution? So the WordPerfect suite was developed in Utah. So you have, their tools. Anyway, so there's lots of examples where one got adopted over the other, and why was that the case? So, spending time on that, then I did the research on that. And as I came out of that really kind of gets the story of how I ended up at Atlas Network. As I did my research, and I actually didn't do it, I did it on football, American football. I didn't do it on policy, but as I was going through and doing, the kind of the summary section and looking at the results, I went back to the Utah instance, and I'm like, okay, we violated that one. We had that inhibitor in place. We had that inhibitor in place. We had that. We deserve to lose. And it really wasn't. The union was one piece of that, but out of 7 or 8 items that if I were to say, listen, if I'm trying to put together a list of what gives me confidence that we're going to get our idea to diffuse and be adopted broadly, 8 out of 8, we missed. So we deserve to lose. So then the question is, how many more times in the freedom movement are we engaging in things where we really don't understand where we are in the diffusion curve, and we are actually either, unintentionally pushing forward things where we're violating kind of these underlying concepts of diffusions in ways that we deserve to lose. And so can we do a better job and not do that, and do the reverse and be more thoughtful and strategic about how we approach how our ideas diffuse in the marketplace?
Are there, along that point, are there a couple of things that are pretty standard to understand, or that our peers and colleagues could think of, that are just inhibiting innovation from scaling, even across political systems? Because you made the point of, well, the teachers union is too big. And I think that's the standard answer every time. Well, the status quo, there's just too much power in the status quo. But that feels like, but man, the status quo was huge. Uber should have never happened, but it did, right? And so are there a couple of things that you would say everyone needs to understand, that, man, if you look at this, it's the easiest way to be able to unlock innovation?
Yeah, and maybe I'll go back and just share a few example from.
Please. Yeah, that's great.
From kind of this like post-assessment of the Utah voucher. So one of the things that is really critical is how far is what you're recommending from the current status quo. So if I look at, the example in Utah, at that particular point in time, you had probably about 3% of the population that were not in a public school. So you're going from 3%, like this percent, to saying, hey, listen, we want this many people now to have school choice. So it was so far out of what everybody's lived experience was, that it was still, I talk about innovators are the weird people, right? vouchers and like school choice, it was still weird. It was too foreign to be normal. Or, now in Utah, it's because of charter schools, more private schools, homeschools growing, et cetera. I think they just passed a universal voucher, and it stick. There was no referendum. The teachers union couldn't do anything about it. Or they maybe could, but it's not worth the political capital. We're not going to win. But I think in Utah now it's 20 there, when they passed the universal voucher, it's close to 25% of students were in some form of non-traditional public school. Again, charter, public, charter, home, private. And I even think of my own neighborhood when we left Utah, right? In the neighborhood, I went to private school for a couple of years and we were the weird kids. But in my neighborhood, there were 3 other families besides us that were doing private school. There were another couple that were in a charter school. So even in our neighborhood, 1 out of every 4 kids was in something else. So it was very normal at that point. I think the second thing where we run into trouble is we tend to measure using the other side's playbook. So for example, how do we measure success of schools? Oftentimes it's test scores. It's really hard to have, one of the things that I think we try to sell school choice, again, it's like as the consumer, I want something that uniquely fits the needs of my child, but I'm going to measure them against a standard thing. And I know for my own kids, like I have 2 children that are dyslexic. Our middle son, I'd probably say is our most intelligent, and yet on standardized tests did the worst. So how do you measure his, like if I put him in an alternative school, his test score is not going to show that he's actually doing better. So how do we identify different ways to measure success that are more freedom-oriented, human-centric, reinforce dignity as opposed to move toward a more authoritarian. I mean, the whole concept of education was built to support the manufacturing line. And so in many ways, it resembles the manufacturing line. So if I can just get the inputs right on the manufacturing line, I'll be able to churn out these kids that look exactly the way that I want them to. But that's not what we believe education is meant to be. To create robots, right? It's to educate, to create citizens, to create productive members of society, but we measure it in terms of robot measurements. So we actually aid and abet our enemies, so to speak, when we measure that way. So I mean, those are 2 examples as I think about it, where we missed the mark, and again, deserve to lose in that case. So like I said, there's lots of others, but those are the first 2 offhand that come to mind.
Yeah, no, this is great. And it strikes me this thought of, okay, with everything you've been interested in, everything you've learned, now we've talked about the role that you have now. Why is Atlas Network uniquely positioned to help and to advance the conversation, the opportunities, the new frontiers, disruptive conversations? Why is Atlas Network uniquely positioned for this?
I think, as I mentioned before, we've got 500, I don't know what the current count of partners is. Let's say it's 550. It seems to hover around that number. If you think about AI works best when it has a lot of data that it can draw from, right? The smaller the data set, the less likely you are to get good data or data that you can rely on coming out of it. So I think part of it for us, because of what we're seeing with grant reports that come in, what we're seeing as we convene these groups together, as we interact, I think we're in a really unique position to see what's working, what's not. I think we've developed a level of trust of our partners that I think is really unique and allows us to have influence with them in a productive way. Not that we're mandating what we're doing, right? It's very much, I think the ethos that we've created, this bottom-up approach, is really significant. I think it's hard to do. I think it's much easier to try to tell people what to do. And I think that we've cultivated an ethos and culture that has really been bought into by our partners, that they really believe that. It's not just something that we tell them that that's what we do, but they actually know that's what we do. And as a result, I think we have their trust and confidence, that we will support them, that we believe in them. And so I think is then, for example, on the grant making front, being able to see hundreds and hundreds of grants come in on a yearly basis allows us to look at Africa. And if somebody's really interested in making an impact in Africa, they might have one or two inputs, 3 or 4. We've got hundreds of inputs that allow us to know, hey, what's worked over the last 10 years? Where is the continent? Where are there maybe the best opportunities to move a particular issue down the ball field to, again, keep with the sports analogies going here. That I just don't think anybody else is in that same position. So, if somebody is, was it the Wolf on Wall Street? Maybe this isn't the best example, or is like, my job is to pour over lots of these reports so that you can make X amount per share, right? Which of course he was selling them junk, but we're not doing that. But that's part of our job, right? The institute relations team and how what they're seeing, and the amount of grants that come in. I just think we've really been able to develop over the last 15, 20 years, really substantive sense, and it's institutional knowledge, right? That's built up of how do you make impact? How do we identify where impact could be made? How do we balance some healthy risk taking, right? Not every grant, we know that not every grant's going to pay off, maybe in the way that we would want. Just like not every investment you make is going to, return. Sometimes they lose, but I think we've developed meaningful intelligence around how to do that. And because of the relationship, so it's not just the intelligence of the inputs, but it's also the relationships, and that takes time, and doesn't happen overnight. And so I think those are, when you take that and then you add on the capability building that we're doing, right? I think the way in which the 3 strategies interlock together and mutually reinforce each other creates this really virtuous cycle of elevating impact, of kind of pushing what was possible. I mean, well, that's not, not only is that not possible, not only is that possible, but even more. And I think, honestly, if we were to look around and say, when I got here and we looked at the Templeton Freedom Award in 2018, I'm not sure that those finalists would be even considered as finalists now. And what that means is the overall movement itself has gotten better over time, and the wins and the impact that they're making. But, that's just a unique place that we get to sit and hopefully help the movement self-reflect in positive ways and do better.
And I appreciate you mentioning the Templeton Freedom Award. Folks can see this year's winner and see all the nominees actually going to atlasnetwork.org. But this year, the winner is announced, as it is every year, at the Freedom Dinner in New York City. So the Liberty Forum and Freedom Dinner every year, every November in New York City. If folks would like to participate, get tickets to attend, or be a sponsor, they can go to atlasnetwork.org right now. And gosh, just the stories of this year's winners from all multiple continents, for our partners and peers are pretty inspiring. So that's a great point that you make. And it makes me wonder, where do you see the most fertile ground right now for innovation? And maybe it's an organization or a particular individual that you see on the cutting edge, or maybe it's just a region that you've been paying attention to, where you say, hey, keep your eyes on this. I'm pretty excited about what's happening here.
Well, selfishly, I think on the AI front, I think there's some real substance. Like, I think we've weeded out some of the pretenders. Not that there aren't going to be some overhype selling. I mean, that's just kind of the nature of software sales. But I think the future of work is going to be significantly changed. And I think that if I look at, for example, Joe Kent's tool and what they developed with AI, right? So there was this massive push, what was it, 15, 20 years? I mean, you probably saw this when you were working in Oklahoma, for transparency, right? We want things, government should be transparent. We want to put the budgets online, you know, closed door meetings, stop that. If you're going to have a city council meeting, stream it. There's, you have to wonder at some level, how does that contribute to some of the performance going on right now on the C-SPAN performing, right? To get clicks, so not all of it has been amazing, but in general, more transparency is better than less transparency. The problem is if I'm a small think tank and I'm trying to monitor 100 different cities and maybe 100 different government agency meetings and different things happening on a regular basis, the human capital required to use that transparency in a substantive and meaningful way up until where we are with AI, you would have needed dozens of bodies to physically watch it and evaluate what's going on. And now with AI, I can have a team of 2 people monitor those 200 meetings, and using the query and kind of the features that we're now familiar with ChatGPT and other tools, Gemini, et cetera. With what Joe has done, I can go in and with a much smaller team, take that transparency work that had been done and now actually make it meaningful in ways that I couldn't before. So I think we're just seeing the next level. And I think there's opportunities like that, not just for meetings, but, I think one of Pacific Legal's doing something on the court case regulation front, like, again, with the big data models and with the LLMs and machine learning and where things are going. I think there's a layer of development and opportunities for us to do some really unique things that I think could really reshape the game. And as I mentioned, even on the private property front. I think in terms of excitement, in terms of a particular region, I think I was just in Germany, and the Liberal Party is kind of dying, but I think Prometheus is building underneath that a renewed, more authentic liberal revival. And I think about what Brazil has done with the IEE conference that they do there, and some of the Students for Liberty work. I think in some of the places the upcoming generation, I always forget which is it, Gen X, Gen Z, Gen whatever. But I would say kind of the 18 to 30-year-olds are very cause driven. And I think, the groups that are capturing those, I think there's some amazing work to be done, because I think the promises of socialism and critical theory of, the oppressed versus oppressor, over time, you realize those are very hollow. And the only way they work is if I am at war at some level with somebody else. And, whether that's a war of words or emotions or, or in some cases bullets. I think what we have to offer is really meaningful and substantive. And I think we're getting better at telling that story in ways that I think is resonating. And, you always go through cycles. I think that's one of the things that I would say even now, the 60s and 70s in the US were challenging, and not just in the US, but abroad. And that gave way to the 80s and 90s. And then, we're in another cycle, right? So I think for us to be realistic about where we are, that there are real challenges, and yet to recognize that we do have ideas that I do think resonate at a very core level with people and do call on their better angels. And while it might be a little bit dark now, I think the message that we have to share, and I think some of these, the underlying student groups and, people that are trying to reach, like him or not, Charlie Kirk, I mean, that was what he was going to the young people and speaking directly to them. And so I think there's a massive opportunity, because I think they were sold a bill of goods in terms of the woke agenda, critical theory that underlied that, and some of these other things that are false promises. And coming out of that, people, I think, are starting to wake up and say, wait a minute, this is not how I want to live my life. Is there something better? And I think if we're there with a good answer, I think there's a real opportunity to capture and change, for the next 20 years, the people who felt like what they thought was the right way to go didn't turn out to be that way.
So I'm going to tie this back into what we were talking about just a minute before with the influence and the opportunity, maybe is a better way of saying it, with Atlas Network. How is the work of Atlas Network in particular helping entrepreneurs? Well, and I'm not just talking about the peers that are working for the partner organizations, but I'm talking about the potential donors, sponsors in the private sector that are trying to find like mind or trying to plug in and help on the forefront. Why is Atlas Network a good partner for them?
Well, I think it goes back to one of the first things we talked about, permissionless, right? Yeah, I mean, to me, one of the most egregious and unethical laws on the books are the certificate of need laws. That I have to go, not only do I have to go to the government, I have to go to my competitors and ask them for permission to build a business.
Yeah.
To me, that it is, it's unethical. I don't think there's any other way to say it, that, and those who prop it up, and from my perspective, it's a classic case of poor ethics. Or even to me, the unethical nature of I'm spacing the name. It was Pacific Legal won last year, the home equity theft. But going back to permissionless, right? Why, as a business owner, if I see an opportunity to bring a service to the market that can improve lives, can reduce the cost of what may be, we know healthcare, at least in the US, I don't think it's just the United States, the cost has grown exponentially, could reduce that cost, which then has a disproportionate effect on those who are not making as much. And yet we've built into society that, no, you have to ask your competitors in the government for permission to go ahead and create that kind of a value. At a base level, our groups are fighting to undo, that systemic bias against the poor and those who are trying to create value. And so, I think, and that's where I think get back to the message. Like, I think, there's a powerful message to be told. And I know we tried to do that with Atlas Network, right? Like, if you really want to help the poor, and Magat Wade keeps pounding on this, right? Poverty is not going to end in Africa through government mandate. It's going to end as we reduce the burden on those who will create businesses, and those businesses create value, they create jobs, they create prosperity, more opportunity down the line. So I think anyone who's, if you really want to help the poor, you're going to find it in the work that our partners are doing. If you really want to create more opportunity for business and better jobs for you, for your kids, for their future, Atlas Network and the work that our partners are doing. These are systemic changes. We're not chasing symptoms. We're trying to change the underlying systems that then ultimately free and allow people to be more prosperous and pursue their best, highest good, which that's, for me, that's why I get excited and energized and why I'm a part of this, right? Because that's what I want.
So let's fast forward. You talked earlier about the folks that were looking into the future and your experience early in your career with a leader of your company that was able to do that, right? So I want you to look 5 years in the future, 10 if you're feeling frisky, but let's just say 5. You and I are having this conversation. We're sitting down for another pod 5 years from now, and what does the landscape look like at that point? Are we still having the same conversation, or are we talking about being on the cutting edge and actually setting the pace of innovation? What do you see? What do you think?
So I think I'll give you the classic answer that we got in my doctoral program from our professors. It depends. So I think if as a movement we do embrace AI, I think also if we take this moment in time and kind of where politics is gone, and we do some really serious self-reflection around where have there been, where are there gaps in what our philosophy, where we maybe missed the mark. And I think it was I'm going to say his name wrong. I think anyway, at the Liberty Forum last year in Asia, Garanchan Das. Anyway, he's the Indian businessman, philosopher. He's done some really critical thinking about where liberalism has some holes in the philosophy and hasn't had good answers for questions. So I think number one, if we can do some really good self-reflection about maybe where we've missed the mark, maybe where we've oversold, or I think going forward I think one of the currencies that's going to be most valuable are organizations that are willing to say, listen, we missed the mark here, and here's how we're going to do better. One of my favorite sports podcasters, broadcasters, commentators is Colin Cowherd. And every Monday he does a segment where Colin was right, where Colin was wrong. And I take him more seriously because of that. Not because I'm not expecting him to be right all of the time. There are times where we're going to have policies that we're going to recommend. And if they don't work, say they don't work. So we made some assumptions. It didn't actually turn out to be the case. Here's where we think we could go next. So I think if we can do some healthy introspection, like how did we end up with Trump? How did we end up with, again, I'm using a bit of the US context, but how did we end up with this mass movement of populism? And part of it, I think, is how democracy was sold, and it was enforced through authoritarianism to a certain extent, right? And we didn't allow it to be a bit messy. So how do we take critical inventory and say, how can we learn from this moment, how we got here? I think the second one, I think if we can do that, plus really embrace where we are today, again, acknowledge the risks, not gloss over them, but embrace what AI, crypto, and these decentralized technologies could do. Again, I think there's a massive opportunity to really really redefine, again, property rights in a way that codifies the dignity of the individual, right? The right to work and not be harassed by a union influence or like some sort of force influence that I have to go one way or the other because I have it's a violation of my property. So I think if that happens in the next, if we really embrace that, I think we could see, I guess the rosy scenario is, I think we could make, to use a comparison in the US, I think we could make the Reagan Revolution look, mediocre. That I think there's, I at the end of the day, tyrannies end up eating themselves. And authoritarian regimes, eventually there's nobody left to cancel. There's nobody left to control, because you've either killed them all or you've put them all in jail. Like, what was it? Somewhere around 50% during Stalin's time were in prisons. An economy can't sustain that. And Reagan recognized free people will outperform, outproduce, so I think, if we can weather the storm in the moment, use it to do some serious introspection and embrace the opportunity that I think this next technological wave could mean for us as a movement, and how we can get better by adopting, build tools that can really, rattle the cage of government, and three, create a policy and kind of public narrative around where we're going, that the future will be brighter and better. And here's how. I think the next 5 to 10 years coming out of this particular cycle, we could see some, much better democracy than what we got the last 20, 30 years.
You've traveled the globe. In fact, you do every year. Is there something you've had on one of your trips that you were like, you know what, I didn't think this was going to be one of my faves, but I loved blank?
I love the food in Turkey. I was just there, back in April, and some of the kebabs, and I guess it's kind of like a pizza, but not. I don't know what they call them, but they were amazing. With our partner there, with Medni, took us to a couple of places that were pretty incredible. So that was food that kind of surprised me. I'm not a big Mediterranean food fan, mainly because I don't like cucumbers. They taste like soap to me. Um,
I can be with you on that. I hear you.
but yeah, the food, some of the places that Medni took us in Turkey were pretty amazing.
Yeah, and Mendini and his team have been doing incredible work on the communications and media space. Folks should go to atlasnetwork.org and find out more about them. All right, let's stick with this theme about travel. Where is I shouldn't say your favorite place, but like where is some place that you've traveled, maybe interacted with the people, the culture, the customs, and you've said, everybody should have the opportunity to go here?
So I'd say two places, and they're very different. So I've always loved India. Their the history, the dynamic of the country. I love the food. The Taj Mahal. I mean, obviously everybody knows the Taj Mahal, which is pretty incredible. But it's just such a unique place, right? And so different from the north to the south, east, west. I mean, it's just a very diverse, unique place, religiously, philosophically, historically. And so and I remember my first time there in 2013, I went for my doctoral program. And there is just kind of an energy there. Yes, there's poverty. Yes, there are challenges. And there is so much like underlying entrepreneurial vibrancy. Yeah, again, I'm grateful CCS is there and some of our other amazing partners that I think have been responsible for helping move the needle there and helping their trajectory and growth from that. They really turned the corner again when they deregulated and abandoned some of the socialist, government tendencies back in the early 90s and saw some significant growth. The other one for me is, I do really love Prague. It's a beautiful city. There's just a lot of fascinating history with Prague. And, I grew up playing classical music, with piano and other things. And so going to some, there's always some great classical musical concert happening somewhere in Prague at a church or wherever that you can go to. So again, just kind of the Jewish sector and some of the history there that you have and the intersection between, the 30 Years War. And anyway, so it's just a fascinating place there. Obviously it was behind the Iron Curtain, so it has some of that history as part of its history. So those are a couple of places that are fascinating to me, and I can go multiple times and not get tired of going there.
So when you are not writing, speaking, facilitating, and leading on behalf of Atlas Network, if I bump into Lyall on the weekend, what are you doing? What's your hobbies? What do you like to do when you're not on the job, so to speak?
If it's got a ball, I like to play it. So whether it's my wife and I, we've got some friends who play pickleball now and then, but tennis, golf, basketball. So yeah, I mean, I really enjoy sport. I love watching, I love playing. So that's one. And then I do run, and part of that's kind of like a mental health thing. But yeah, you'll probably find me on the weekend going and finding a new trail to go run on, and enjoy that kind of mental disconnect, just to go and head out, be kind of alone in my thoughts and just run and clear things out. So get a good sweat on. Yeah.
And pro tip for anyone, if you want a unique athletic experience, invite Lyall to a game. He and I attended a minor league baseball game about a year ago, and that game that we were at, one of the innings actually tied the minor league record for most home runs hit in an inning, which I didn't know at the time while we were there. We were just talking, and I was like, another one? Really? What is happening right now? But turns out, like, we saw some offensive firepower. So, yeah, right. We were there. Okay, one last question for you. You know that development's a big thing for me. I've always loved fundraising, philanthropy. I've loved both sides of the conversation there. So, if there is someone watching right now that is thinking about making a gift to Atlas Network, if someone approaches you and says, "Hey, should I invest? Should I give to Atlas Network? Will it make an impact on the worldwide freedom movement?" What would you say to them?
Yeah, I think it goes back to a bit of what I said earlier. I want to chase, and I want to chase. I want to fix systems, not symptoms. I mean, sometimes you do have to address the symptoms, but I think what we're trying to work on in the worldwide freedom movement is to address the underlying systems in terms of government that get in the way of people being prosperous, free, peaceful, etc. And so that's, for me, that's maybe the pitch else for policy, right? Which is really what we do and engage in. The other part of that is that policy doesn't stay if I don't also invest in the hearts and minds of people. Again, that's a systemic solution, right? It's a long-term solution. So if those are the two places where if I want to see systemic long-term change in the direction of greater freedom, openness, prosperity, health, well-being in the world, there's no better place than to invest in the freedom movement. And, if you want to, identify your best investment advisor to do that, to identify the ways in which, your $10,000 can best be applied across that global sphere, or even if there's a region in particular, like let's say Asia, that you're really interested in, how can, there's maybe an affinity there or culture, whatever. Nobody knows that region better than we do, and can make sure that your investment is deployed in a way that's going to get the most bang for the buck for those that you care most about, and seeing freedom and, move in that direction. So.
Well, Lyall, thank you for your time today. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. I look forward to the next conversation we get to have. And folks, thank you so much for joining us on another episode of Atlas Network, the podcast where we bring you the voices and the leaders and the stories from all throughout the worldwide freedom movement. You can find more of these episodes on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you consume podcasts. And again, I encourage you to go to atlasnetwork.org and get involved with Lyall and I and our peers throughout the worldwide freedom movement today. Until next time, have a good day.